Chapter 1. The Goose at Dawn. Meadowbrook always woke slowly. Nestled between rolling hills and open meadows, the town stretched lazily under the soft morning light. Dew sparkled on the lawns, and flowering dogwoods framed the sidewalks with delicate bursts of white and pink. As the hours passed, the stillness of dawn gave way to the hum of life. Children's laughter spilled into the air as they hopped through chalk-drawn squares or raced their bikes with carefree abandon. In the parks, dogs dashed across the grass, chasing frisbees with tails wagging and boundless glee. But at dawn, the world belonged to the quiet. Willow Lake Park, situated on the edge of Meadowbrook, welcomed its earliest risers in hushed serenity. The lake shimmered under the pale morning light, its surface mirroring the sky's soft hues of pink and orange. A fine mist hovered above the water, and the tall willow trees swayed gently, their long branches brushing the ground like whispers of the night before. Mrs. Thompson considered herself part of the park's daily routine. At 72, she still took her morning walks with Patch, her spirited terrier, a ritual as unshakable as the sunrise. Wrapped warmly against the dawn chill, she moved with surprising energy, her sturdy frame guiding Patch down the winding gravel path. Patch trotted ahead, tail wagging, nose ever curious about the scents of damp earth and wildflowers. Yet something felt different this morning. They were following the path that curved along the lake when Patch suddenly froze. His small white paws rooted in the grass, ears pricked sharply. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Mrs. Thompson stopped, startled by his unusual reaction. "What's the matter, Patch?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the still air. Patch offered no explanation other than a tense bark. Then, with startling speed, he lunged towards the reeds by the water's edge. Mrs. Thompson's heart leapt. "Patch, come back here!" she called, fumbling for the leash she had let hang loose. Then she saw it. Lying in the grass near the reeds was a Canada goose. At first glance it appeared to be sleeping, its body still, head tilted toward the ground. But as she edged closer, her stomach lurched. The bird's long black neck was twisted unnaturally, its wings spread as though frozen mid-flight. And then there were the markings. Mrs. Thompson gasped, her breath catching in her throat. Dark red symbols, jagged, uneven, streaked across the goose's feathers. Thick lines, hastily drawn, smudged as if done in a rush or under threat of interruption. They seemed to pulse in the growing sunlight, though she tried to tell herself it was just the dew playing tricks on her eyes. She crouched, her hands trembling, reaching toward the goose as if to confirm what she already knew. Patch barked again, louder this time, his body tense as he stared beyond the reeds. "What are you barking at?" she whispered, torn between the lifeless goose and her dog's agitation. Then she noticed them, faint footprints in the mud beyond the reeds. They were shallow but distinct, leading away from the lake in an uneven line. Her eyes swept the surroundings, searching for any sign of who might have left them. "Hello?" she called, voice wavering. Only the soft lapping of the lake answered her. A shadow flickered in her peripheral vision, and she whirled toward it, her heart pounding. But there was nothing, only the swaying branches of willow trees dipping lazily into the water. A deep chill crept into her chest. Canada geese weren't just any birds. They mated for life and returned year after year to the same nesting grounds. Finding one dead, desecrated with strange symbols, felt like a violation of something sacred. She stood slowly, pulling Patch close by his leash. Though her hands shook, her voice remained firm. "Come on, Patch, we're going home." She hurried back along the gravel path, sneakers crunching over the stones, the image of the lifeless goose etched in her mind. Several times she looked over her shoulder, but the rising sun illuminated only a placid lake and the pale morning mist. Its quiet beauty felt unsettling now, masking a deeper darkness. As she left the park, she passed the wooden sign proclaiming Willow Lake Park, a Meadowbrook treasure. The cheerful lettering seemed to mock her. Clutching Patch's leash, she quickened her pace, her thoughts spinning with dread. Once home, Mrs. Thompson promptly called the Meadowbrook police. She explained what she had found, her voice tight with urgency. The dispatcher tried to calm her, but Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than cruelty. It was a message. And somewhere, perhaps closer than she dared to imagine, someone was watching, waiting to see how Meadowbrook would respond. Chapter 2. Live Report and Adrian's Curiosity. In Meadowbrook, news traveled faster than the morning breeze, especially bad news. By mid-morning, word of the red symbols on the Canada Goose had spread to every corner of the pristine town. Willow Lake Park buzzed with activity, its usual serenity replaced by the fluttering of yellow police tape and the murmurs of a growing crowd. Joggers slowed to a halt, neighbors in robes peered from a distance, and teenagers snapped photos with their phones, their curiosity outweighing any sense of decorum. Among the onlookers stood Lina Wynn, Meadowbrook's local reporter. Fresh off her morning coffee and armed with a microphone, she was ready to broadcast. In her late 20s, Lina had a magnetism that distinguished her, a confident posture, wavy brown hair catching the sun, hazel eyes bright with determination. She wore a fitted black leather jacket over a white blouse, dark jeans, and ankle boots that sank lightly into the dewy grass. A silver pendant glinted at her neck when she shifted. She tilted her microphone, smiling patiently as the camera operator adjusted the focus. The operator gave a thumbs up, the camera's red light flicked on, and Lina began her report with seasoned poise. Good morning, Meadowbrook. I'm Lina Wynn, reporting live from Willow Lake Park, where an unsettling discovery has shaken our quiet town. She gestured toward the shimmering lake behind her. Earlier today, a resident found a Canada goose along the shoreline, its feathers marked by strange red symbols. Authorities haven't issued an official statement, but the markings suggest far more than mere vandalism. The camera panned to show the growing crowd and the taped-off area before returning to Lina's face. The early sun lit her features softly, yet her tone was resolute. Canada geese are known for their loyalty and cyclical migration. To harm such a creature seems deliberate, even symbolic. Right now, our community is left to ask, what does this mean for Meadowbrook? She lowered the microphone, signaling the camera operator to cut the live feed. As the camera's light faded, Lina exhaled, letting some of her composure slip. In her time reporting, she had encountered odd events, but this one felt different. It hinted at something bigger than just vandalism. Something more ominous. Looks good, the operator said, gathering his equipment. Lina offered a half smile and moved closer to the caution tape. Her fingers found the silver pendant at her neck, a subconscious gesture she often made when deep in thought. Across town, Ayderian Lee leaned back in his leather office chair, his laptop open on his mahogany desk. He had just finished watching Lina's live report. The final frame of her face lingered on his screen, her hazel eyes sharp and probing. At 35, Ayderian was Meadowbrook's go-to problem solver, a lawyer with a knack for unraveling mysteries, both legal and otherwise. His office was a reflection of his meticulous nature, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined with legal texts, philosophy tomes, and neatly organized case files. A large window overlooked the bustling town square, its cheerful activity a stark contrast to the unease brewing at Willow Lake. Ayderian rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt and reached for his porcelain cup of green tea, its steam curling into the air. His sharp, dark eyes narrowed as he replayed the footage, pausing on details most would overlook. In the background, near the wooden sign, half hidden by swaying willow branches, he noticed a figure standing too still, too far from the crowd to be casual. The figure disappeared before the report ended. A slight, satisfied smile curved Ayderian's lips. Those responsible for chaos often lingered near their own deeds, observing the effects. He clicked a pen and began to jot a list on a yellow notepad. Symbols, deliberate, Smudged equals haste. Goose equals cycles, loyalty. Figure in background, watcher or participant. Timing suggests intent. Lina Wynn, detail-oriented, insightful, senses something is off, follow up. Setting the pan aside, Ayderian moved to the window. He gazed out at the sunlit town square, watching townspeople go about their business. Everything looked so normal, yet the Goose's grim discovery hinted at something far from ordinary. He glanced once more at his laptop, then reached for his jacket. Whatever puzzle began at the lake, he couldn't look away from it now. Chapter 3. The Meeting at the Community Center. Word of the urgent meeting spread quickly, and by early afternoon, the Meadowbrook Community Center buzzed with anxious energy. Families, retirees, and small business owners filled the spacious hall, their voices blending into a low hum of concern. The room, usually warm and inviting, now felt charged with tension. A refreshment table at the back offered steaming coffee, platters of muffins, and sugary pastries, but few seemed to have an appetite. People clustered in small groups, whispering rumors about the painted goose. Some dismissed it as a tasteless prank, while others feared it was a harbinger of something darker. In a quieter corner of the room, Lina Wynn sat at a small table, her open laptop between her and Ayderian. While conversation pulsed around them, Lina was absorbed in video clips, tapping keys to pause or rewind. Ayderian, seated slightly angled toward her, radiated calm focus. The faint aroma of coffee mingled with low chatter as he spoke. "Seen anything unusual in the footage?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. "Not yet," Lina replied, freezing a frame on the screen. "It mostly shows the crowd gathering after the police arrived. I don't see anyone acting overtly suspicious." She looked at him, brow knit in thought. "I can't stop wondering why someone would do this. It seems like a message, right?" Ayderian nodded, his dark eyes intent. "Whoever did this chose a goose on purpose. It symbolizes loyalty and cyclical migration, and doing it by the lake wasn't random. It's meant to unsettle people, disrupt normalcy. The police will handle the what, but we need the why, and that means asking who gains from creating fear in Meadowbrook." Before Lina could reply, a middle-aged woman in a floral blouse approached, clipboard in hand. "Excuse me," she said politely. "Are you Miss Wynn and Mr. Lee?" They both nodded. "I'm Susan Harper from the Meadowbrook Parks Board," she said, adjusting her glasses. "We've decided to restrict access to Willow Lake until further notice. The symbols have everyone worried, and we don't want to take chances." "That's reasonable," Ayderian agreed with a measured nod. "Has anyone done a thorough examination of the site? There might still be clues left behind." Susan frowned. "The police did a quick check this morning, but left soon after. They didn't find much beyond the goose. Why? Do you think there's more?" Ayderian leaned forward. "It's likely. A vandal had to bring paint, place the symbols, and flee. Details like paint smudges or footprints can offer big insights." Susan considered this, then nodded briskly. "I'll speak with the Parks Department about another inspection. We don't want to miss anything." She offered a tight smile before joining a nearby group. Lina watched her go, turning back to Ayderian. "You really think the police missed something?" Ayderian gave a small, mischievous smile. "People almost always do." Lina shook her head, amusement mingling with curiosity, and returned to her laptop. "If there's something left to find, I'm betting you'll spot it." Over the next hour, the gathering wound down, people drifting out in clusters, still murmuring speculations. Lina and Ayderian remained at their table, reviewing notes and ideas in a subdued, methodical way. Ayderian glanced at Lina. "So, what's your next step?" She sighed thoughtfully. With the park closed, I'll need a different approach. I might interview residents or look into Canada goose migration data. Someone chose that bird for a reason. I want to know why." Ayderian gave an approving nod. "Good instincts. If you need a second opinion on footage, or just someone to brainstorm with, I'm around." A light smile curved Lina's lips. "You volunteering to be my intern?" Let's call it a collaboration, Ayderian replied, amused. Lawyers like to keep busy. They walked out together into the crisp afternoon air, the community center lawn still dotted with lingering residents. But Lina and Ayderian had already begun to dig below the surface, searching for the truth beneath the veneer of their quiet town. As they reached their cars, Lina remembered Ayderian's earlier question, who benefits from creating fear or uncertainty in Meadowbrook? And somewhere, someone was watching closely, waiting to see what they would discover next. Chapter 4. The Watchful Eye. By nightfall, Meadowbrook's streets returned to their usual hush. Porch lights glowed softly, curtains drew across large picture windows. On the surface, everything seemed peaceful, but the anxiety sparked by the Willow Lake vandalism lingered. While most of the town prepared for bed, 2 residents quietly pressed on with their investigations. In her snug home office, Lina Wynn wrestled with ideas well past dinner time. A mug of cooling herbal tea stood forgotten on her desk. Her workspace was a chaotic collage of notes, printouts, and a large map of Meadowbrook pinned to the wall. Pushpins in different colors connected dots on the map, spots where she suspected some pattern might emerge. Each pin was linked by a trail of red thread, creating a growing labyrinth of clues. She frowned at her laptop screen, replaying an interview she had conducted earlier that day. In it, a local resident described hearing strange noises near the lake, but only after dusk. Another tip mentioned a series of minor vandalism acts around Meadowbrook that preceded this Goose incident by a few weeks. Nothing conclusive, but enough to fuel her instincts. Patterns, Lina, she reminded herself in a hushed voice. They're always about patterns. She scribbled the word disruption on her notepad, circling it emphatically. A goose with red symbols wasn't just about cruelty. It was about shocking a town that prized its cozy normalcy. She let out a slow breath, massaging her temples. The goose wasn't random, she murmured, her hand reaching for the tea without a glance. It's too symbolic. Cycles, migration, loyalty. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. She took a sip, grimacing as the cold liquid touched her tongue, and placed the cup aside. Lina's attention shifted to a printed police report that was thoroughly marked with her handwritten notes. One phrase caught her eye. Red paint streak found on willow branch. She underlined it. Rushed, she muttered, the word lingering in the silence. They were interrupted. If it happened once, they might be nervous enough to slip up again. She turned back to her corkboard, studying the pushpins that marked key aspects of Meadowbrook's daily life. Willow Lake's tranquility, the old gazebo's significance, the intersections where routines converged. Lina suspected the vandals' actions weren't just about destruction. They were an intentional effort to disrupt the town's predictable patterns. She jotted a final note on a small pad. Order versus disruption. Who benefits? Satisfied with her night's progress, Lina stood and stretched, her lamp throwing a large shadow of her on the wall. They'll strike again, she told herself, and I'll be ready. Meanwhile, across town, Ayderian prowled the nighttime streets with a slim box of cameras tucked under one arm. These wireless battery-powered devices were discreet enough to blend into the scenery, enabling him to keep watch over Meadowbrook while he slept. His first stop was Willow Lake. By moonlight, the water looked almost black, and the willow branches swayed gently in the breeze, recalling the morning's grim find. Ayderian knelt beneath one willow, securing a camera to a low branch with careful, quiet movements. From this vantage, the camera would capture the gravel path and the cluster of trees along the shoreline. Satisfied with the angle, he moved on, eyes sweeping the area by force of habit. If they come back, he whispered, we'll know. He continued to an intersection near Willow Lake, where Meadowbrook's main roads joined. Occasionally, a car rumbled past, headlights flashing across the lamppost. Ayderian attached a second camera high on that post, ensuring it overlooked the road, sidewalks, and seating areas. They'll try to avoid attention, he murmured, but they also want to be seen just enough to provoke fear. He moved deeper into the town, planting a third camera near a busy intersection on the edge of a small commercial strip. He hid it among low hedges, pointed at a crosswalk and adjacent parking lot, potential thoroughfares for someone traveling between important landmarks like the gazebo and Willow Lake. Finally, Ayderian arrived at the old gazebo in the town square. Under the gentle glow of street lamps, its white wood looked almost ethereal. He took a moment to admire the gazebo's white pillars, bathed in soft amber light. "Your symbol, too," he muttered to the structure, "and if they're obsessed with symbols, you might be next." Kneeling behind one of the posts, Ayderian positioned the final camera. He was able to obtain an unobstructed view of the gazebo and surrounding walkways. Standing up, he brushed dirt from his dark slacks. The cameras were ready, silent observers posted at Meadowbrook's most meaningful sites. Returning to his home office, Ayderian reviewed his notes in the soft glow of his desk lamp. On a smaller corkboard to his left, he had pinned a simplified version of Lina's lines of inquiry: cycles, symbolism, the psychology of disruption. Tapping a pen against his chin, he replayed the evening's setup in his mind. "They're not finished," he said, eyes roaming over a note that read, "Fear thrives on uncertainty. Endgame?" As the minutes ticked by, the newly placed cameras across Meadowbrook worked quietly, recording empty streets and silent parks. Lina, in her home office, scrawled one last observation before shutting down for the night, and Ayderian, back at his desk, contemplated the next steps in unraveling the pattern he saw forming. Chapter 5. Shadows and Surveillance. A nighttime light breeze stirred the branches of old oaks lining the sidewalks outside 218 Walnut Street. Inside Ayderian Lee's home office, the hush was replaced by the hum of multiple computers, their screens displaying a mosaic of live camera feeds. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, followed by Cooper's light-hearted voice. "Hey, Ayderian! Rumor has it you're still awake. Got coffee, or do I need to bring my own survival kit?" Ayderian opened the door. John Cooper stepped in with a theatrical sigh. In his early 30s, Cooper wore a gray hoodie and jeans, his sandy blonde hair slightly disheveled under the lamp's glow. "All right, so earlier today I ran some errands, and every single person I bumped into was talking about that goose. My barista tried to foam a goose on my latte. Not sure it was a compliment." Ayderian rolled his eyes, half amused. "At least she gave you something on the house?" Cooper shrugged. "Nope, she charged extra. Apparently goose foam is artisanal." Ayderian gestured to the laptop. "Perfect timing. I need your brilliance to help set up a real-time motion alert." Cooper replied in mock displeasure. "Ah, yes, my brilliance, exploited for data entry. Let me see if I can manage in my fragile, caffeine-deprived state." Seated across from each other at a cluttered wooden desk, Ayderian and Cooper spent the next hour finalizing the camera feeds. Soon, the hum of multiple computers and monitors filled the air as Ayderian studied various cameras. Against one wall, a large whiteboard displayed a detailed map of Meadowbrook, spotted with colored pushpins marking each site where Ayderian had placed cameras earlier. At one end of the desk, Ayderian focused on a monitor with calm intensity. Next to him, Cooper alternated between scrolling through live camera feeds and crunching data on a laptop. His laid-back but alert manner often balanced Ayderian's methodical approach. "These cameras are great," Cooper remarked with a quick grin as he typed. "Small, discreet, and the resolution's better than I expected." "Practicality first," Ayderian replied, barely shifting his gaze from the screen. "I appreciate the extra set of eyes on the tech side." Cooper chuckled, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "Flattery accepted. Still, everything's quiet so far, just empty paths and an occasional passerby. Whoever's responsible for the goose vandalism, he's keeping low." "They will slip up eventually," Ayderian said, leaning back. "Meticulous planners can't resist making their next move, and that's when they leave us a clue." Their steady routine was interrupted by a soft ping. A notification flashed on one of the monitors. "Motion detected," Cooper said, sitting upright. He clicked to bring up the Willow Lake camera feed. In the grainy scene, willow branches swayed, dark shapes against darker shadows. For a moment, nothing. Then, a figure stepped into view. "Got someone," Cooper murmured, fingers flying over the keyboard. He zoomed in as much as possible, but the feed was too dark to reveal more than a silhouette. The figure was dressed in dark clothing, face obscured. He crouched near a willow tree, movements deliberate. "Too far from any light source," Ayderian commented, eyes narrowing. "Hard to see what he's doing." Cooper leaned closer to the screen. The figure seemed to fiddle with something on the ground, then stood and glanced around. After a moment, they headed back the way they came, pace increasing. Seconds later, the camera captured the faint outline of a vehicle parked near the trail entrance. Its headlights flicked on, illuminating the area momentarily before pulling away. "Boxy shape," Cooper noted. "Older SUV, I'd guess. Possibly a Bronco? Brown paint, maybe?" Ayderian gave a short nod, thoughtful. "Yes, definitely boxy. Not enough clarity for a plate. But everything about that was purposeful. Park, move quickly, leave, no hesitation." Cooper rewound and froze the frame on the SUV's silhouette. "No way to read the license plate," he murmured. "But if this shows up in any other feed, we'll catch it." He typed rapidly. "I'll add an AI tracker for a Bronco or similar SUV, color brown or close to it." Ayderian leaned forward, dark eyes alert. "So we'll be alerted if this vehicle reappears on any camera?" Cooper nodded, already typing. "Yes, I've fed it into the system. Anytime a Bronco-like SUV shows up, we'll know." He worked in silence for a moment before glancing at Ayderian. "Anything else you want tracked?" Ayderian hesitated for a fraction of a second, then said, "Lina's news van, that might be useful too." Cooper raised an eyebrow. "The white one with the station logo?" Ayderian nodded, keeping his tone neutral. "She's likely to be near any major developments. Tracking her could give us a heads up on where the action is, or where she thinks it is." "Makes sense," Cooper said, turning back to his laptop. "If she's chasing leads, we'll want to know where she's heading." "Exactly." Ayderian nodded, his voice even. "It's just for updates, you know." Cooper finished setting up the AI tracking system and leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses. "Okay, it's live. If the SUV or Lina's van shows up on any of the feeds, we'll get a notification." Ayderian offered a quick, satisfied smile. "Excellent. Now, we wait." Cooper glanced at the clock on a side monitor. 12:48 a.m. He yawned as he stood to stretch. "We've done enough for one night. Let's let the cameras do the work." Ayderian drummed his pen against the desk, his gaze sliding over the map. He could almost sense the shape of a pattern emerging among the pins and lines. After a moment, he nodded. "You're right. Let the cameras do the work for now. But if we get a notification—" Cooper grinned, standing to pack up his laptop. I know. You'll be the first to know." When Cooper was gone, Ayderian lingered, eyes fixed on the colored pins. Somewhere out there, the person behind the painted goose was setting up the next move, and Ayderian fully intended to be ready when it happened. Chapter 6. Patterns. The soft chime of a notification broke the silence in Ayderian's home office. It was mid-afternoon, and the room was bathed in the warm glow of sunlight streaming through the large window. Ayderian leaned forward in his chair, his sharp eyes scanning the monitor. The AI tracking system Cooper had set up hours earlier had flagged a motion event, pulling up grainy footage from one of the cameras near an intersection close to Willow Lake. A faint outline of a boxy SUV slid into frame. It moved slowly, lingering at the edge of the camera's range before rolling past and disappearing into the distance. Ayderian rewound the footage and played it again in slow motion, jotting down a note. SUV at 2:43 p.m., intersection near Willow Lake. He frowned thoughtfully. The SUV was nothing new. He had flagged it several times that morning, though it didn't appear at every site tied to the geese or the vandalism, only certain locations. He flipped through several other feeds, and sure enough, it showed up again. "It's not random," he murmured, tapping his pen against the desk. The driver's pattern was deliberate, yet not fully consistent. At least, not enough to make immediate sense. Switching to another feed, he saw something else. In nearly every location associated with the vandalism and geese sightings, flocks of geese meandered along the water's edge or lounged in grassy nooks. But the SUV only showed up at certain spots, skipping others with no obvious reasoning. What's the connection? He wondered aloud, frustration blending with fascination. He rewound the clips, playing them in reverse order to see if a clearer timeline emerged. As he traced the SUV's movements backwards, patterns began to form. "There you are," Ayderian whispered, eyes narrowing as he pinpointed the SUV yet again, this time at an intersection on another feed. It looked suspiciously like an older Bronco, an increasingly familiar silhouette. He leaned back in his chair and scrawled down time and place. Continuing to scrub forward, Ayderian noticed a second vehicle, a white van bearing a news station logo. He froze, his pen hovering mid-air. It was Lina Wynn's van. He watched the footage intently, his jaw tightening as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Lina's van passed the intersection minutes before the SUV. On another feed, the same pattern repeated. Lina's van went through, and shortly after, the SUV followed. Ayderian set down his pen, his expression darkening. A cold realization struck. The SUV wasn't just circling random locations, it was following Lina. Grabbing his phone, Ayderian dialed the number listed on Lina's station profile. It rang 3 times, then went to voicemail. "This is Ayderian Lee," he said, voice calm but urgent. "I've been reviewing some footage, and I believe you may be in danger. Please, call me back as soon as you get this. It's urgent." He ended the call, dropping the phone onto his desk with a frustrated sigh. All that work at the community center," he muttered, "and I still don't have a direct number." Setting the frustration aside, Ayderian opened Lina's X profile on his laptop. A fresh post caught his eye. "There's more to this. Stay tuned. #breaking. The tweet read like someone on the verge of a major breakthrough. Ayderian switched to the live feeds and brought up the camera overlooking the main road out of Meadowbrook. A notification pinged again, highlighting a white van traveling towards the mountain road. Ayderian frowned. That route led to the Willow Lake Reserve, a remote area with little traffic at this area. "Lina, what are you doing up there?" he murmured. Without hesitation, he snatched his jacket and keys. Pausing at the entryway table, he grabbed 2 long flashlights, his trusted candlesticks, and tucked them inside his jacket before heading out. Climbing into his car, Ayderian hit the hands-free dial for Cooper. After 2 rings, Cooper answered, sounding groggy but alert. "Ayderian?" he said. "Meet me at Willow Lake Reserve," Ayderian replied, steering onto the road. His tone was sharp. "What's going on?" Cooper asked, concern growing in his voice. "I've been tracking that SUV," Ayderian said, urgency tightening his words. "Lina's heading to the reserve, and I think she might be in danger." "Danger?" Cooper echoed, his tone rising. "What kind of danger?" "I'll explain when you get there," Ayderian answered curtly. A brief pause, then Cooper asked, "Will you be okay? You're not exactly one to pack anything, truly defensive." Ayderian glanced at the flashlights resting on the passenger seat. A faint smile tugged at his lips, though his voice remained serious. "I brought the candlesticks." Cooper let out a short laugh, momentarily dispelling the tension. "All right, Ayderian, just don't do anything reckless. I'm on my way." "Good," Ayderian said, his focus back on the road. "Hurry." He ended the call and pressed the accelerator, the quiet streets of Meadowbrook blurring past as he raced toward the mountains. Ayderian's thoughts churned like an oncoming storm, outpacing the steady hum of the engine. Chapter 7. The Lake Reserve and the Van. The road to Willow Lake Reserve twisted through mountain paths, thick trees blocking most of the sunlight. Ayderian drove swiftly, heart pounding, eyes scanning for any sign of Lina's news van. His thoughts raced faster. What had Lina stumbled into? And more urgently, how far behind her was he? When he reached the parking lot, the stillness hit him first. The faint hum of crickets buzzed at the edges of the oppressive quiet. Ayderian turned on his headlights to cut a swath through the gloom. His eyes swept the clearing and locked onto Lina's news van, parked at an awkward angle. The driver's door hung open, as if someone had fled in a panic. Ayderian climbed out of his car, flashlight in hand, and approached the van carefully. The bright beam revealed scattered papers fluttering in the faint breeze, and a microphone lay nearby, its coiled cable stack on the ground. Everything about the scene screamed of haste and danger. His pulse quickened. Lina wouldn't just leave her equipment strewn like this. He crouched, shining the light over the dirt near the van, inspecting the area. Scuff marks in the gravel formed a confusing pattern leading away from the vehicle toward a narrow trail. He traced them with his light, mind piecing together their meaning. Footprints. They weren't deep, nor were they large. Someone smaller, lighter. The patterns were erratic, not the strides of someone fleeing in terror, but of someone resisting, struggling. Ayderian's jaw tightened. "No gun," he muttered under his breath. If the person who'd taken Lina had been armed, she wouldn't have fought back. She would have complied. That much was clear. He rose, directing his flashlight up the trailhead. The faint prints in the dirt veered off the main path onto a less traveled route. Whoever had Lina wasn't taking her somewhere public. They were heading deeper, somewhere hidden. Ayderian dialed Cooper. "I'm about 30 minutes out," Cooper answered, tension in his voice. "What's happening? Did you find her?" Ayderian kept his gaze fixed on the trailhead as he spoke. "Her van's here, driver's door open, papers scattered. Footprints lead into the woods, but she's gone." There was a brief pause before Cooper responded. "Ah, and you're waiting for me before charging in, right?" Ayderian glanced down at the flashlights in his hand, his grip tightening slightly. "I'll manage." Cooper made a noise that hovered between a groan and a laugh. Yeah, great, just don't get yourself permanently damaged, okay?" Ayderian allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "I'll do my best." He ended the call, slipping the phone into his pocket. The path ahead was narrow and dark, trees crowding overhead to block what little light remained. Ayderian followed the footprints carefully, each step swift yet measured, senses pricked for any sign of movement. As he pressed deeper, the forest's ambient noise faded into an uncanny hush. A scrap of fabric snagged on a branch caught his eye. Its frayed edges bore traces of red paint. Ayderian carefully extracted it, heart pounding. Whether Lina left it as a clue or her captor dropped it by accident, it confirmed that he was on the right track. He pushed forward, his pace quickening. The path grew more treacherous, littered with roots and rocks that threatened to trip him. The trees pressed closer, their gnarled branches clawing at his jacket as if trying to hold him back. Then his flashlight found something unnatural. Dense undergrowth tangled over a rocky ledge, concealing a small, crumbling entrance. The damp, musty air that emanated from within carried faint traces of mildew, and something sharper, like burnt sage. Ayderian's pulse quickened. He swept aside the vines to reveal a narrow, old tunnel. The damp stone walls looked worn by time, footprints in the dust marking a recent passage. Lina had been taken inside. Without hesitation, he stepped into the darkness. Chapter 8. The Tunnel and Mr. Wicked. The tunnel was colder than Ayderian had anticipated, the damp air clinging to his skin like an unwelcome shroud. The dim beam of his flashlight slid across the rough stone walls, illuminating the remnants of an older time. Wooden beams warped with age, scattered rubble, and faint streaks of moisture glistening like silver threads. He moved carefully, his footsteps softened by a thin layer of dirt and debris, but the silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint murmur of a voice ahead. As he approached a bend in the passage, a flicker of orange light caught his eye. Rounding the corner, he froze. The narrow corridor widened into an underground chamber, its walls alive with flickering shadows cast by an array of candles. The flames danced erratically, their golds and oranges throwing the chamber into sharp relief. The walls were marked with symbols painted in deep crimson, their jagged lines and curves glowing faintly in the wavering light. The symbols seemed to shift under the play of shadows, creating an effect that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. At the center of it all stood a man, medium build. His presence was almost stately, dressed in a charcoal gray three-piece suit that seemed untouched by the grime of the tunnel. His gloved hands rested lightly on a ceremonial staff, its polished wood glinting in the candlelight. Behind him, an altar draped in dark fabric bore unlit candles, bowls filled with unknown substances, and a dagger with a carved handle, its surface catching the wavering light. Ayderian's gaze shifted to Lina. She sat tied to a wooden chair beside the altar, a red shawl draped loosely over her shoulders. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with defiance as they met his briefly, before flicking back to the man in the suit. The man turned slowly to face him, a faint smile playing on his lips. His piercing blue eyes held a peculiar intensity, the kind that put one on edge. "You are the lawyer from the community center," he said, his tone smooth, almost casual, as if they were meeting at a social gathering. Ayderian tilted his head slightly, his flashlight steady in his hand. "And you're the man who drives an SUV and likes to chase Canada geese," he replied, his tone calm but laced with quiet challenge. The man's lips curved into a thin smile. "You've been observing. Good. I appreciate someone who takes notice." Ayderian's gaze swept the room, lingering for a moment on the flaring candle flames. The light seemed alive, almost chaotic in the way it swayed, making the crimson symbols on the walls appear to ripple. The man followed his gaze, his smile widening. "Beautiful, aren't they?" he said, gesturing to the candles with his gloved hand. "I call them poets of light." "Poets," Ayderian echoed, tilting his head as though considering the statement. "What poem are they reciting?" The man's expression grew reverent, as if Ayderian had posed the most profound question imaginable. "The poem of renewal," he said softly. "The world is full of darkness, corruption, stagnation, decay. But here," he gestured with his staff, the polished wood gleaming in the candlelight, "here, light is born anew." Ayderian's eyes narrowed slightly as he stepped closer, the beam of his flashlight skimming across the altar. The man gestured toward the flickering flames, his gloved fingers graceful, almost reverent. "Most people see the flame," he said, his voice taking on a weighty tone, "but they never stop to observe the wick, the thing that burns so the flame may live." Ayderian raised an eyebrow, tilting his head thoughtfully. "Curse those who ignore the identity of the wick." "Precisely," the man replied, his voice softening with a kind of pride. "The wick sacrifices itself for the light. It consumes itself for something greater. I am the wick, and with my flame I will restore balance to a world lost in darkness." Ayderian's lips curled into a faint smile. "So you're saying you're wicked," he said. The man's smile widened, mistaking the remark for genuine admiration. "Ah, yes," he said, his voice almost delighted. "Wicked! I rather like that. You can address me by this name." Ayderian resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He needed to keep the man talking, to stall for time. Lina's fingers were working subtly at the ropes binding her wrists, but she needed more time, and Cooper would surely arrive soon. "Fascinating," Ayderian said, his tone turning conversational. "But if you're the wick, who exactly is this light you're trying to ignite? What happens after you complete this ceremony of yours? And this restoration involves tying up a reporter?" The man flickered his gaze to Lina before returning to Ayderian. "She is more than a reporter. She will be my energy. The wick cannot burn without wax as fuel, and Lina will sustain me as my spiritual bride." Ayderian paused his breathing, only to exhale slowly, his gaze steady. "Sounds romantic. Does she get a say in this arrangement, or is this one of those sacred traditions where consent of the betrothed is a mere formality?" The man's expression darkened for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. He gestured to the crimson-painted walls. "This ritual was sacred to the Aztec people. They lived in central Mexico a long time ago. They understood the cycles of light and darkness, and light demands sacrifice. The sun can't rise without blood to fuel it." He raised the staff high, its carved tip gleaming ominously in the candlelight. "And so I call upon Huitzilopochtli, the great sun god, to bless this union. And with every union there requires an offering. You," he pointed the staff at Ayderian, his gloved hand steady, "shall be the sacrifice to seal this cycle." Ayderian raised an eyebrow, his tone as dry as ever. A bit dramatic, don't you think?" His grip tightened on his flashlight, his sharp eyes studying every detail of the room, looking for every physical advantage. Wicked ignored him, turning back to the altar and lifting the dagger. "The world will thank me in time," he said solemnly, his back to Ayderian. Adrian's gaze darted to Lina. Her fingers had loosened the rope around one wrist. With the dagger in his hand, Wicked turned and stared at Ayderian. Without warning, he lunged forward, his dagger arcing through the air with great speed. Chapter 9. Showdown in the Shadows. The dagger gleamed in the erratic candlelight as Wicked drove the blade forward in a fencer's thrust aimed directly at Ayderian. Ayderian twisted at the waist, narrowly avoiding the attack, and brought up his flashlight just in time to block a second slash. The clash of metal on metal rang through the chamber, reverberating off the stone walls. Wicked followed up with a wide arc of the blade, forcing Ayderian to lean back to avoid the strike. Wicked's precision left little room for error. Each movement was fluid, practiced. He wielded the dagger like an extension of his arm. Ayderian stepped back quickly, pivoting on the balls of his feet to evade the next thrust. "Not bad for a man who spends his time painting geese," Ayderian quipped, his tone dry, but he was clearly on the defensive. Wicked advanced relentlessly, his attacks coming faster now, driving Ayderian toward the chamber wall. The crimson symbols painted on the walls seemed to pulse in the flickering light, their jagged edges elongating as the flames danced wildly. Smoke curled from toppled candles, filling the air with a sharp, acrid scent. Wicked's strikes came in rapid succession. Low feints, high slashes, keeping Ayderian off balance. Each block with the alloy flashlight sent a jolt up his arm, the force making his grip unsteady. "You're out of your depth," Wicked sneered, his eyes blazing with zeal. He stepped forward with a sharp diagonal slash, and Ayderian barely parried it, the blade skimming past his side. Wicked used the momentum to pivot, closing the distance between them. "You should have stayed in your office. This is a place for transformation, not bookworms." Ayderian felt his back press against the rough stone wall, the cold seeping through his shirt. Wicked's dagger came down again in a swift overhead strike. Ayderian twisted, the blade slicing through the air just inches from his shoulder. He pivoted away from the wall, his breath coming fast, his mind racing. Then, Ayderian smiled. "You talk about cycles," he said, sidestepping Wicked's next thrust with a calculated shift of his weight. "But I have to say, this whole sun god shtick feels more like a midlife crisis." Wicked hesitated. "A midlife crisis?" he repeated, his tone dripping with disdain. "Why? Because it's the end of your life?" Ayderian shrugged, raising his flashlight as if to block another attack. "The crisis is all yours. You think I'm going to fight you with flashlights?" With a smooth twist, he separated the flashlight sections, revealing the connecting chain. He snapped them into place with precision, spinning the newly formed nunchaku in a tight, controlled arc. "What you don't realize is that your fight is with this." Wicked's expression faltered for a brief moment, his confidence giving way to suspicion. "A lawyer with a nunchaku? How quaint." Ayderian didn't bother responding. The nunchaku spun in his hands, the alloy glinting in the light as it moved with deadly precision. Wicked lunged again, the dagger driving forward in a straight line, but Ayderian twisted his body, letting the blade pass harmlessly by his side. In the same fluid motion, the nunchaku whipped forward and struck Wicked's forearm with a resounding crack. The The dagger slipped from Wicked's hand, clattering to the floor. He let out a sharp grunt of pain, but recovered quickly, spinning toward the altar and grabbing his ceremonial staff. Wicked swung the staff in a wide, horizontal arc, aiming to knock Ayderian off balance. Ayderian ducked low, the staff whistling past his head, and retaliated with a sharp upward strike from the nunchaku. The alloy weapon connected with Wicked's shoulder, forcing him to stagger back. Wicked regained his footing and swung again, this time with a downward strike, but Ayderian sidestepped and brought the nunchaku down on Wicked's lower leg. The blow forced Wicked to one knee, his face contorted with pain. "Stay down," Ayderian muttered, spinning the nunchaku again. Wicked growled, gripping the staff tightly as he lunged upward with a desperate thrust. Ayderian twisted to the side, using the momentum to step behind Wicked. The nunchaku struck Wicked's back with a sharp crack, sending him stumbling forward into the altar. The flames roared higher now, consuming the dark fabric draped over the altar and spreading to the painted symbols on the wall. Smoke thickened in the chamber, stinging Ayderian's eyes and making each breath harder to take. His focus shifted, and his gaze snapped to Lina, who was still tied to the chair near the altar. She was coughing, her fingers working frantically at the ropes around her legs.
"Ayderian,"
she called, her voice hoarse.
"I can't. This fire's gonna take the whole place down."
"I'm getting you out of here," Ayderian said, his tone resolute. Wicked snarled from behind him, grabbing the staff and swinging it once more. Ayderian barely deflected the strike, the clash of wood and alloy sending vibrations up his arms. Wicked charged forward, but Ayderian countered with a swift strike to his wrist, forcing him to drop the staff. "Enough," Ayderian said firmly, spinning the nunchaku one last time before striking Wicked's shoulder. Wicked collapsed to the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he glared up at Ayderian with unbridled hatred. Ayderian didn't waste another second. He turned to Lina, rushing to her side. "I've got you," he said, his voice softening as he pulled at the remaining ropes binding her legs. The smoke was suffocating now, the flames licking closer to where they stood. "Can you stand?" he asked, steadying her as she shifted in the chair. Lina gave a faint nod, her legs shaking as she pushed herself upright. Ayderian quickly wrapped an arm around her shoulders, guiding her toward the exit. Behind them, the fire roared, its oppressive heat clawing at their backs as they stumbled through the dim tunnel. Cool night air struck them like a wave as they emerged from the aqueduct, coughing and gasping for breath. Lina leaned heavily against Ayderian, her face smudged with soot, yet her expression remained resolute. "Are you okay?" Ayderian asked, his grip still holding her arm. "I'm fine," Lina replied, brushing ash from her shoulders. "Thanks to you." Ayderian turned to glance back at the tunnel. Thick, black smoke poured from the entrance, curling into the night sky. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. "I don't think he's coming out," he said. Lina followed his gaze, her expression hardening. "Good," she muttered. Chapter 10. Outside the tunnel. The Willow Lake Reserve was now cloaked in an uneasy silence. The cool night air carried the acrid smell of smoke drifting from the tunnel. The lake reflected faint ripples of moonlight, its glassy surface broken only by the occasional splash of a fish. Towering pines stood motionless in the faint glow of emergency lights, their shadows stretching across the forest floor like dark sentinels. Ayderian leaned against the rough bark of a moss-covered tree, letting his breath steady as the adrenaline drained from his body. His coat was streaked with soot, his hands still faintly smelling of smoke. Near the water's edge, Lina sat hunched on a fallen log, her jacket dusted with ash and her hair disheveled from the ordeal. Lina glanced at Ayderian, her voice hoarse from smoke.
"Not exactly the ending I had planned."
She forced a small smile, though it didn't fully reach her eyes. "You're alive," Ayderian replied simply. He allowed a faint smile to appear, though fleeting, as he leaned back slightly. "That's a good start." She laughed weakly, then coughed, waving a hand at the smoke.
"Alive, sure. Still processing everything. I was tied to a chair, surrounded by fire, listening to some lunatic call me his spiritual bride."
"And you still found a way to get free," Ayderian said, his gaze steady. "That's more than most would have managed." Before Lina could respond, the crunch of gravel drew their attention. Cooper emerged from the tree line, his flashlight beam cutting through the thinning smoke. Behind him, the pulsing red and blue lights of police cars painted the forest in shifting hues, casting fleeting shadows across the pines. A paramedic trailed closely behind him, their medical bag swaying with each step. Cooper approached, his expression a mixture of relief and exasperation.
Ayderian, I swear, you couldn't have waited 5 minutes for backup?
Ayderian stood and dusted off his coat.
Would you have brought an ancient ceremonial weapon and a full understanding of nunchaku techniques?
Cooper blinked, then shook his head with a sigh.
No, I'd have brought some common sense.
Exactly, Ayderian said, his tone dry as ever. Cooper turned his attention to Lina, his concern overtaking his frustration.
You okay?
He asked, crouching slightly. Lina nodded, though her voice wavered.
I'll be fine, just a little smoke and...
She gestured vaguely toward the aqueduct.
Whatever that was.
Cooper motioned for the paramedic, who stepped forward and began checking Lina's vitals. She hesitated, but allowed the examination, her shoulders sagging as she exhaled. While the paramedic worked, Cooper turned to Ayderian, his voice dropping slightly.
The officers are sweeping the tunnel now. I brought them as backup after your call. Did you find him?
Ayderian's gaze shifted toward the smoking aqueduct, his sharp eyes scanning the faint orange glow still visible at the tunnel's entrance.
What do you think?
No body? Cooper guessed, frowning.
No body,
Ayderian confirmed, crossing his arms. Wicked didn't stay to be burned. He planned for this. His obsession with cycles, returning, repeating, it wasn't just talk. If he escaped, it wasn't on impulse. It was part of his design. Cooper sighed, running a hand through his hair.
So he's still out there, and we're back to square one.
Not quite, Ayderian said. He'll leave a trail. He did before, and he will again. A police officer approached, his flashlight bobbing slightly as he walked.
The fire's out, he reported. We found remnants of candles, some scorched fabric, and partially burned symbols. No sign of anyone inside.
Ayderian nodded, unsurprised.
Check the perimeter for tracks, footprints, tire marks, anything. He wouldn't have gone far unless a vehicle was nearby.
The officer nodded and returned to the search. Ayderian turned back to Lina, who had just finished with the paramedic. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself as she stood, steadying herself against the log. Anything broken? Ayderian asked lightly.
Just my faith in tranquil towns like Meadowbrook,
she replied, her voice carrying a faint edge of humor.
Welcome to the club, Ayderian said, sitting down beside her again.
I take it you didn't see where he went?
She shook her head. I was focused on getting free, and after that, it was all fire and smoke.
Her voice lowered.
I can't believe he's still out there.
He is, Ayderian said firmly, his expression hardening. But he's not invisible. People like him always leave trails. They can't resist being seen. Cooper joined them, glancing between the two.
So, what's the next move?
Ayderian tapped a finger against his temple, his mind already churning. The symbols, the geese, the patterns, he's methodical, and everything he's done so far has been part of a larger plan. We just need to figure out what his next step will be.
Do we have time for that?
Lina asked, frustration creeping into her voice.
What if he's already planning something else?
We have time, Ayderian replied. Wicked doesn't act without an audience. He needs to be seen, understood. He'll leave something for us to find. Before anyone could respond, a shout rang out from near the tunnel.
Over here!
The three hurried toward the sound, their footsteps crunching over loose gravel. Near the entrance to the aqueduct, a police officer knelt, holding up a small, scorched object. Ayderian stepped closer, crouching to examine it. It was a torn page from a book, the edges blackened, but the center intact. A single crimson symbol was drawn at its center, jagged and precise, and beneath it, an uneven handwriting were the words, "Return, repeat, rewrite." Lina shivered as she stared at the page.
That's his writing. I saw him scribbling something earlier.
Return, rewrite, repeat, Cooper said, frowning. Not ominous at all.
Ayderian's expression darkened as he handed the page to the officer. As the paramedics prepared to leave and the police continued their search, Lina pulled her jacket tighter around herself. Her voice was quieter now, but steady. "He's not going to stop, is he?" "No," Ayderian said, "but neither will we." Cooper sighed, glancing back at the smoldering tunnel. "So what's next? Do we wait for him to make a move?" "No," Ayderian said, his gaze sharpening. "We dig. His symbols, his ideology, his history. This cycle of his can be broken, and it will be." Lina stepped closer, her determination returning. "Then let's break it." Ayderian nodded, his voice resolute. "We will." Chapter 11. Back to Normal. A few days had passed since the confrontation at the Willow Lake Reserve. The morning sun spilled over Meadowbrook, painting the quiet suburb in soft gold and green. Beneath the shade of a flowering dogwood, Ayderian and Lina sat at an outdoor cafe, their table a quiet island amid the gentle bustle of early risers. The scent of freshly brewed coffee blended with the faint sweetness of blooming flowers, while the distant hum of lawnmowers wove into the laughter of children chasing a stray soccer ball in the nearby park. Lina cradled her tea, her fingers idly tracing the rim of the cup. The events of that night lingered in her expression, not as fear, but as a quiet, steely resolve. Across from her, Ayderian sipped his coffee, his crisp white shirt with rolled sleeves radiating a composed demeanor that contrasted the chaos they'd weathered together. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence. Then Lina spoke, her voice soft yet probing. "How did you know I was in danger that night?" Her question wasn't pointed, but felt like the final piece of a puzzle she was ready to solve. Ayderian took a measured sip from his coffee, letting the question linger before answering. "It was expected," he said, setting the cup down with a soft clink. "The man was never after the geese." Lina tilted her head, her brows knitting together. "What do you mean? The symbols, the geese, the locations? He went to a lot of trouble for something he didn't care about." Ayderian nodded, his dark eyes glinting with quiet intensity. "Exactly. The geese were a diversion. He chose Canadian geese specifically because of their predictable behavior. They returned to the same nesting grounds, all conveniently near lakes and isolated areas. That predictability allowed him to create the illusion of a serial vandal targeting birds." He paused, leaning forward slightly. "But his real intent was never the geese. It was you. Every act, the strange markings, the carefully chosen locations, was a breadcrumb trail meant to lead you to him." Lina's breath hitched. "He did all of that just to get my attention? To make sure I'd show up with my camera?" Ayderian nodded. "Precisely. The settings were designed to ensure you'd follow the trail, piece it together, and, more importantly, report on it. The SUV we tracked often showed up after your news van. Wicked wasn't just watching the scenes unfold, he was watching you. Once he knew you were invested, he set the final trap." Lina's expression hardened, her fingers curling around her coffee cup. "But how did he know where I'd be? I don't exactly announce my plans in advance." "That's where the geese come in," Ayderian said, his voice steady. He knew the media would cover the incidents, and as Meadowbrook's most persistent and capable reporter, you were the obvious choice to follow the story. It wasn't a question of if, it was only a matter of when. Lina's brow furrowed as she processed this. "But how did he know I'd go to the Willow Lake Reserve? That wasn't on my radar until that morning." Ayderian tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "That's where his plan became more direct. Someone submitted a tip about an injured goose at the reserve, didn't they?" Lina blinked, then nodded. "Yes, someone messaged me about it. No name, no details, just that they'd seen a goose in trouble. I thought I'd better go before it was gone or something. It was only a short drive away." Her voice trailed off as realization dawned. "That was him, wasn't it?" "It was expected," Ayderian said, leaning back in his chair. "Once I noticed the pattern, the vandalism at predictable goose stopovers, I cross-referenced a map of their typical locations. The Willow Lake Reserve stood out, and while researching the area, I found an old photograph of the aqueduct, from before it fell into disrepair." Lina let out a frustrated breath, her hands tightening on her cup.
So the symbols, the geese, the vandalism, it was all fake? Just a ruse to get me interested?
Yes, Ayderian said, his voice steady. He painted those symbols to throw off anyone looking too closely. To the casual observer, or even the police, it would seem like nothing more than harmless vandalism. Just bizarre enough to catch your interest, but not alarming enough to warrant a full-scale investigation. That way you'd keep following the story, but the police wouldn't devote significant resources or escalate to a manhunt. He crafted the perfect bait. Lina's agitation flared, and she leaned forward, her voice sharp.
This man has to be brought to justice. He can't get away with this.
Ayderian's gaze softened, but there was steel in his voice. He will be. Men like Wicked crave attention. They want to be understood, even feared. That need will betray him eventually. Before Lina could respond, her gaze caught on something pinned to the cafe's notice board. Nestled among flyers for yard sales and yoga classes was a single sheet of paper, its edges slightly frayed. The phrase return, repeat, rewrite was scrawled across it in bold black letters, and beneath it, drawn in red ink, was the unmistakable outline of a candle. Lina felt a chill run down her spine. He's still out there, she said, her voice low. Ayderian followed her gaze. His eyes narrowed, but there was no fear in his expression, only determination. Yes, he said quietly. He's not finished. Lina turned back to Ayderian, her determination unshaken.
Then neither am I. He wanted my attention? He's got it. I'm not backing down.
Ayderian nodded, his respect for her evident in his calm gaze. And I'll be here to help. He's hiding behind symbols and illusions, but the law, social justice, and truth will bring him down. With better luck, we can stop the trouble before it starts next time. Lina's expression softened, a small smile curving her lips. She picked up her coffee cup and raised it toward him. To better days? Ayderian tilted his cup toward her, a faint smile warming his face. To better days, he echoed. The ceramic cups clinked softly together, sealing their partnership. Around them, the world continued to bustle, birds chirping, the hum of passing cars. But between them, a quiet determination had taken root. Wicked's game was far from over, but so was their pursuit of the truth.